Welcome back to our final week of history, and today we are going to be continuing our discussion about the rising Cold War tensions with the discussion of probably the closest to war that the Soviet Union and the United States ever reached during the Cold War, and that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a pretty widely known event in the United States, but several outcomes of this crisis would shape the later Cold War and would certainly play a pivotal role in bringing the United States and the Soviet Union closer to a peaceful relationship. Up to this point in 1962, the communication between the Soviet Union and the United States was very limited, and much of that communication was hostile. And after 1962, there's going to be much more bilateral or group conversations. And in my opinion, the United States and Soviet Union never moved again as close to war as they did during this event. Now, that being said, there were several scares that almost led to a nuclear exchange between the two powers, but no event brought them so close to intentionally declaring war on each other as the Cuban Missile Crisis did. Now, to understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, we do need to go back and, number one, talk about some aspects of the Cold War that we have not discussed yet, and number two, talk about the presidential campaigns and elections that had preceded President Kennedy's entry into the White House. So let's start with the U.S. presidential elections first. With FDR's death in April of 1945, he was replaced by his vice president, Harry Truman. Harry Truman was an unusual choice. He was selected because he was a political moderate, and the former vice president of FDR had grown too liberal and left-leaning, and there were some concerns that he might lose the election for FDR. And so FDR switched to Harry Truman, who was a state senator from Missouri before this. With Truman's ascension to the White House, he was in a very difficult position because FDR had kept almost all of his official programs and state secrets to himself and had told Truman very little of what he intended to do about a number of things, including the atomic bomb, which we've discussed previously, and what he intended to do about the Soviet Union, peace in Europe, and many other things. So Truman, when he walked into the president's office, he was in a very difficult situation. He had to make a lot of decisions with very little guidance from his predecessor, and he had to work hard to make the right decisions and do what needed to be done. Truman would go on to win re-election in his only election campaign. He entered the presidency so early as vice president to president, that he only ran for one term. In fact, the United States Congress passed a law during Truman's official first term, his actual second term, that presidents could not run for more than 2 terms if they had served at least 2 full years of a previous term. And they couldn't run for a third term if they'd won 2 elections. And so Truman never got to run for a second term. Not necessarily that Truman would have run for another term after he was done, but he was now prohibited by law. By the way, that law was put into place because of President FDR's unprecedented 4 terms. He had won election 4 separate times, and the United States Congress believed that that was a violation of the original intention of the founders. President Washington had served 2 terms and had set by precedent that as the limit of executive power, as the limit of how long a president should stay in office. And in some ways, I can forgive FDR a little bit for staying in power for as long as he did, because World War II was going on during his 3rd election and during his 4th election. So there was an unprecedented threat to the world during this time that needed steady leadership. But still, I agree with Congress's decision to limit to 2 terms. I don't think a president needs any more than that. Truman is replaced by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower is a Republican, and so he is the first Republican president since Herbert Hoover. So FDR had won in 1933, and now Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to take the presidency in 1952. So there's about a 20-year gap between Republican presidents, and Eisenhower is back in as president and does a number of things. Number one, Eisenhower is largely responsible for ramping up the opposition to global communism, although Truman was certainly responsible for this as well. Truman was the one that started the war in Korea, or responded to the North Korean invasion in Korea, I should say. Truman was not responsible for starting that, but he was responsible for committing American troops, which I think was the right decision. Eisenhower is going to continue to ramp up this policy. In fact, it's Eisenhower who famously says that communism will affect states like dominoes. So if one state falls to communism, it will have a bleeding out effect and affect all of the states around it, and you will have a line of dominoes where each one falls in sequence to communism. And so Eisenhower puts significant pressure on multiple communist nations to stay contained, and he begins committing troops to active engagement in different areas throughout the world. This is going to have profound consequences on the United States, not only in the crisis that we will talk about today, but also in the Vietnam War, which we'll discuss in class. After Eisenhower's presidency, which is really important and did a lot of things, and I wish I had enough time to tell you all about the U.S. highway system and the other things that he did, he is replaced by John F. Kennedy. Now, this was a surprise because Eisenhower's vice president was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was a young senator from California, very popular, highly expected to win the next election, and he was defeated by JFK, who in some ways was a political outsider. His family was not a political outsider, certainly, but JFK himself was relatively unknown until he had a meteoric rise after World War II. JFK's father, John Kennedy, in fact, JFK actually is John Frederick Kennedy Jr., and his father then being John Frederick Kennedy Sr., JFK Sr. always intended for one of his sons to become president. In fact, there's this interesting quote from before World War II that Joey is going to be president. Joey was his oldest son. Unfortunately, his oldest son died during World War II, and so he focuses attention on his second son, who eventually did attain the presidency. JFK is also notable because he is one of the first modern marketed presidents. Much of what JFK did would set the pattern for future presidents. For example, JFK wrote a book, except he didn't write the book. One of his campaign staffers wrote the book, and his name was placed on that book. And by the way, every modern president has done this. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump have all written books that are not, in fact, written by them, but their names are on them, and they kind of represent their political platform. That's what was going on with JFK. Many people have pointed out that JFK didn't seem to have any firm beliefs on any subject, and in fact, he probably was not a well-cut-out man for the presidency itself, and that is in some ways backed up by some of the poor decisions and difficult decision-making process that he went through when he was president. Many of his decisions were made for him, specifically by his father. So many people have accused JFK of being really just a show for the Democratic Party, and I think there's a little bit of truth to that. Certainly JFK was not a gifted decision-maker. He oftentimes relied on aides to help him make decisions, but at the same time, there is a aspect of not being the smartest man in the room. Remember, Herbert Hoover was absolutely the smartest man in the room, and yet he often struggled to deal with the problems presented by the Great Depression. So just because JFK didn't have a lot of his own ideas doesn't necessarily make him a poor president. We'll instead let his actions speak for him, rather than kind of the hubbub that's around JFK himself. I should also mention that under both Truman and Eisenhower, a new alliance system had been created around the world. In 1945, we mentioned very briefly the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations is supposed to be a world governing body that provides assistance and provides suggestions and sometimes even military intervention to police the world and prevent a World War II. NATO, on the other hand, is designed more specifically, and it's specifically designed to counteract the Russian threat. The NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is generally an alliance of the United States with the nations of Western Europe. Although today NATO's members are all over the place, including several that don't border the Atlantic Ocean at all, let alone the North Atlantic. So NATO today is a little bit broader than just the North Atlantic. But think about the nations that would be connected by the North Atlantic. Of course, we've got the United States. We've got nations like Canada, the UK, France, and the Scandinavian countries. And from there, it grew and grew and grew. NATO is specifically designed to enable these countries to put together their armed forces to counteract a Russian threat. The United States, being a democracy, had a mandate by its people to attempt to balance its own budgets. Americans don't love paying taxes, and so for many American senators, there was a very big appeal to ramp down American military power, at least from a conventional perspective, keeping lots of troops armed and equipped, and instead shifting over to the new nuclear weapon systems, which were much cheaper to maintain. Think about the difference in what it costs to build a single missile, which then can sit in a silo for dozens of years, costing almost no money, or training hundreds of thousands of troops and paying them salaries day by day, week by week, month by month. It might seem like the missiles are more expensive, but in reality, nuclear weapons are some of the cheapest ways to maintain your power worldwide available. So the United States, after World War II, drastically reduced the size of its military. On the other hand, the Soviet Union was run by technically committees, but of course in reality by effective dictators, and those dictators had no spending requirements whatsoever. They could mobilize the entire Soviet state to produce weapons and supply an army, and that's exactly what they did. So for most of the Cold War, the Red Army, the army of the Soviet Union, was much more powerful than the army of the United States. But the United States instead heavily invested in its ability to deploy nuclear weapons. Let's talk about those nuclear weapons in a segue into the discussion we need to have about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as earlier mentioned, were replaced very quickly. Remember, the Soviet Union developed their own atomic weapon in 1949. The United States responded to this test by developing the next class of nuclear weapons called the hydrogen bomb, which is a much larger, much higher yield weapon that can devastate entire cities rather than just the center of cities like the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were. These bombs, including the new hydrogen bombs, were all plane-delivered weapons. In other words, you needed to fly a bomber over a location and drop the bomb on the city, very similar to how the bombs in World War II were dropped. And this presented several difficulties. Number one, it is possible to shoot down planes before they drop their warheads, and so a robust enough fighter defense might deter a nation from using their nuclear weapons. Number two, planes, while they are very quick and they have very long ranges, do not have infinite range, and it's difficult to fly planes directly from the United States to Moscow and vice versa. And so the United States and the Soviet Union began to develop several different technologies that would enable them to get their nuclear weapons closer at all times. Number one, the United States had a plan to put a number of planes into the air whenever threat levels got high, and that way these planes already in the air would have a much shorter time to arrive at Moscow than planes just taking off the ground. This also prevented the threat of the Soviet Union attacking U.S. airfields and destroying the planes before they could move. Both the United States and the Soviet Union also began looking into missile technology. The United States had captured a number of German engineers who worked on the famed V2 program, which was a program that launched missiles into low orbit that fell on cities like London and others. And the United States realized that this missile delivery platform could be used for nuclear weapons. And so they began to develop missiles that could take nuclear payloads from sites in the United States or its allies and deliver atomic weapons to Soviet cities. And this technology is eventually duplicated by the Soviet Union. It takes them longer because they have less access to the German scientists that worked on the program, but they are able to get their own missiles out of production and into the countryside. And this begins to really cause a doomsday scenario because it quickly is realized in the late 50s, early 60s that both the United States and the Soviet Union produced so many nuclear weapons that any nuclear exchange would almost undoubtedly destroy both nations. Even if the United States successfully bombed everything that the Soviet Union had in easily accessible locations, it's possible that Soviet Union bombers and missiles fired as soon as the United States was confirmed to have launched their own would fly towards the United States. There was nothing the United States could do, and both superpowers would be destroyed in nuclear fire. And if this happened, the rest of the world would die as well, because as a side effect of nuclear weapons going off, they kick up immense amounts of not only radiation, the thing that nuclear weapons are most famous for, but they also kick up ash clouds, and this ash would settle into the upper atmosphere, and in a large enough nuclear exchange, this would effectively wipe out all crops and therefore kill the human race through starvation. Not a pleasant experience, to say the least. Both the Soviet Union and the United States also began to develop a third arm to this capability, and that was their submarines. Nuclear reactors had been experimented with in large ocean-going vessels for a long time, and people realized that putting a nuclear power plant in a submarine would effectively make that submarine able to operate infinitely away from port. It would simply need to surface to take on more air and food, but the actual sub itself could run almost indefinitely. The United States was first to begin arming these subs with their own nuclear weapons, and effectively what these subs served as is invisible, completely undetectable submarine nuclear launchers. If there was an attack on the United States, the submarines would surface all around Russia and fire their missiles, hoping to destroy Russia in what's called a second strike. So between the bombers, the nuclear missiles, and these nuclear submarines, we have what's oftentimes called the nuclear triad. All three of these were required to have a nuclear-capable offensive force. But both the Soviet Union and the United States claim that nuclear weapons were used only for defense. They would never launch the first strike. Instead, they would wait for the other side to fire at them. And to do this, the United States specifically, and the Soviet Union later on, specifically announced that all of their weapons were pointed at Soviet cities. Now you might ask, why in the world would the Americans announce this? Well, the idea was this. You have two viable targets for nuclear weapons. You can attempt to destroy the missile silos and the airfields where nuclear weapons are stored, or you can target cities and attempt to wipe out the command structure of the other side. Now, if the nuclear weapons have already left their silos, if they've already taken off their airstrips, if the other side has already launched their nuclear attack, bombing their own airstrips and missile silos would accomplish nothing. And so by pointing your weapons at the cities, you've effectively committed to a retaliation-only action. There's no missiles pointed at the actual nuclear sites at all. We're only going to fire at your people if you fire at our people. And the Soviet Union eventually shifts its focus there as well. So effectively what the two superpowers were doing was pointing a huge humanity-killing gun at each other and saying that I will only use this for self-defense. Now many people were very concerned about this during the Cold War itself, but as it turns out, at least so far as of when I'm recording this, neither side has pulled the trigger. And certainly, the United States and Russia still have the capability to blow each other to pieces right now, unfortunately. As scary as that thought might seem, it is still possible, certainly, but it has not happened. And the tensions are far lower now than they were in the event that we are now, finally, after all of that background, going to be able to talk about. The island of Cuba is a large Caribbean island approximately 90 miles away from the bottom of Florida, at least at its closest point. And in 1957, it had begun undergoing a revolution that ended with a communist power in charge of Cuba, led by a man by the name of Fidel Castro, who actually recently died. Fidel Castro and the communists were, as you might be able to guess, unpopular with the Americans themselves. And so the Americans isolated the communist Cubans. And in fact, in 1960, attempted to invade Cuba by using Cuban-trained American immigrants that would hopefully attack Cuba, overthrow the communist government, and bring about a democratic government that would be able to manage the nation instead. And this invasion is called the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it fails spectacularly. And this invasion led the Cuban authorities to seek out help from an alliance. And that alliance that they sought out was an alliance with the Russians in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in secret talks with the Cubans in 1961, agreed to supply Cuba with weapons, specifically with short-range nuclear weapons that Cuba could use to deter a further United States attack on Cuba. And eventually, this secret agreement was leaked to the West, and the United States became aware that the Soviets might begin to supply the Cubans with nuclear capabilities. And again, this is a site 90 miles away from Cuba. If Cuba had chosen to launch a missile would have hit the United States almost before it would have warning to retaliate against them. And so this would be of grave threat to Americans. The United States, upon learning of this, had a relatively lax attitude, specifically because it was an election year and the American political process was focused on other things. And so an American plane was dispatched to spy on the Cubans to see if there was any truth to this rumor. And unfortunately, what the plane found was a number of missile sites being cleared in the Cuban jungles. And in addition to missile sites, it detected multiple large missiles and several surface-to-air missile systems. Surface-to-air missile systems, or SAMs for short, can shoot planes out of the sky, and this effectively indicated to the United States that the rumors were true. And it was even possible, although not confirmed, that Cuba already had nuclear capability and could strike the U.S. if they so choose. Because of this, on October 22nd, 1962, President Kennedy, who had been in office now for almost a year, but it was still a tumultuous time based on the election, decided to blockade Cuba. and told the Soviet Union that under no circumstances would they allow weapons to be moved into Cuba, and if any weapons had been moved into Cuba, the communists needed to remove them. This conflict got incredibly heated when several Soviet transport ships attempted to break the blockade and were stared down by U.S. warships, including one famous incident where the two ships sailed together, the U.S. ship blocking the Soviet ship from sailing to Cuba for several hours. And things got really tense. In fact, a group invented what was called the Doomsday Clock, which goes from 12 p.m. to 12 a.m. and they put 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. and they put the clock itself at 11:59, 1 minute away from midnight, the closest the world ever got to full-out nuclear war, because the Soviet Union and the United States both seemed adamant not to back down. And President Kennedy stood up American troops all over the world, including in Berlin, and it looked very, very likely to both sides that a war might start and nuclear weapons might be exchanged based on the events going on in Cuba. Fortunately for the world, negotiation was going to be successful, and the president and Premier Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, were able to come to an agreement to disassemble the missiles currently in Cuba and to stop supplying Cuba with firepower for an American agreement not to invade Cuba again. And the United States gives this promise, and so the Soviets begin to withdraw their weaponry from Cuba. Now, what was unknown to the American public at the time, but which has later come out, is that the United States made a second concession to the Soviets, and they agreed to remove their nuclear weapons from Turkey, which is in a very similar position to how Cuba is for the U.S. If you look at the map, Turkey is very close to Russia. It could be used to hit several important Russian cities, including Kiev and Moscow, which would have done immense damage to the Russians. And again, it could have happened so fast that the Russians did not have a chance to retaliate. So in exchange for removing the Cuban missiles, President Kennedy removed missiles from Turkey, and possibly Italy as well. There's actually a scholarly debate out there whether missiles in Italy were removed because of this agreement or whether they were simply moved to different locations, and that debate is actually still being had. With that done, fortunately, the world is going to realize that they had gotten very close to destroying themselves, and several important changes are going to be made. Number one, the United States and the Soviet Union are going to begin an era of slightly more cooperation. The United States and the Soviet Union had effectively been at each other's throats for the last 20 years, and it was finally recognized that that was probably not an effective way to go about global business. And so the two sides began talking, the two sides began open diplomatic relations again to some extent, despite the fact that they were still very opposed to each other and would back rival sides in a number of conflicts around the world. They decided that having a little bit of contact was not exactly a bad thing, especially when it might prevent the destruction of the entire world. Another thing that was brought about because of this crisis was the Washington to Moscow Red Line, and that is that famous telephone that sits on the president's desk. You might have seen it in a movie or even in a press conference done from the Oval Office. It is a red telephone. That red telephone, at least during its first inception, was a direct line between Washington and the White House and the Kremlin in Moscow. And the president could pick it up and talk directly to the Soviet premier, and the two men could negotiate face-to-face directly. Well, not face-to-face, I suppose they were talking on the phone, but it was a direct line of communication, and that would prevent the kind of diplomatic wrangling that had gone on during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The president and the premier had to take several steps to talk to each other, and many people believe that disconnect almost led to nuclear war. And so this was a way for the president instead to talk directly to the Russians and to negotiate if he needed to, and for the Russians to negotiate with the president as well. With all that being said, the Cuban Missile Crisis in many ways marks the middle of the Cold War, but is certainly not the end, and the Cold War would continue until the 1980s and even the 1990s in some people's estimation. Some people count the end of the Cold War as 1889, which is when the Iron Curtain fell and many nations in Eastern Europe became part of the West and became democratic again. Some people don't count it until 1991, which is the actual breakup of the Soviet Union, the large communist power that the United States had been fighting against. Either way, we'll discuss that in class this week. Our final actual recorded lecture is going to be about the complicated events surrounding the Watergate scandal.